Friends, we look backwards in order to chart the course forwards, to know where we've come from and what values and practices kept us alive and going as a community during all those years. I'm sharing with you this morning a sermon delivered in this house on March 30th, 1958, by the Reverend Vincent B. Silliman, Doctor of Divinity, the Reverend Doctor. Vincent Silliman was the minister here in the 1950s, as well as a very influential person in Unitarian and Unitarian Universalist music. Then his name appears in several of the hymns in our hymnal, or on the lyrics and music, and he was a member of the Hymnal Commission. March 30th, 1958, Reverend Silliman delivers a sermon called The Present and the Days That Were, a sermon reviewing and interpreting the history of more than 80 years, in 1958 already, more than 80 years of the Beverly Unitarian Church. This is what he writes. My purpose this morning is to review the history of the Beverly Unitarian Church and to suggest some of the meanings of this history covering more than 80 years. It is sometimes stated that this church began with religious services in the home of the Edward Nieburgers. I've forgotten already that in the 1950s, the family name for everyone would just be the man's name as head of household. In any case, in the home of the Nieburgers, who were chiefly responsible for the idea in October 1941. This was true of the church known as the Beverly Unitarian Fellowship, and which was organized in 1942. But that Beverly Unitarian Fellowship is only part of the Beverly Unitarian Church of today. For on a torrid August evening in 1951, two congregations met together in this room. One was the Beverly Unitarian Fellowship. The other was People's Liberal Church. And on that night, the two churches merged their memberships and all their other assets and became one church. The place chosen as the church home of the United Church was this structure, built as a residence in 1886, in which we're now assembled. And the name chosen for the United Church was the name of one of the two components, Beverly Unitarian Fellowship, a name which had been known in this neighborhood for 9 years by then. The members of the People's Liberal Church brought with them their ownership of a church building at 65th Street and Stewart Avenue, a building they had occupied for slightly over 60 years, and they brought with them also the man who had been supplying their pulpit for a year or so, Reverend Hartley C. Ray, who now became minister of the merged church. Sale of the old building was not achieved until some months following the merger. Part of the money realized was used for improvements which were necessary or desirable because of the larger numbers and the burst of enthusiasm which resulted from the merger. Most of the rest was set aside to serve as the nest egg for a new church building. Silliman, preaching this in 1958, was preaching it before the addition was added on. Preaching in 1958, the congregation then was planning to tear down the castle as an old relic of a bygone era and replace it with a thoroughly modern building. What a colossal undertaking, he continues, what a colossal undertaking followed here upon the sale of the old building, taking down the mighty wall which used to stand where the light trough is now in this room, installing the steel beam hidden by the light trough, making new draperies, laying a new floor, painting the room, all carried forward by the skills and abilities and strengths of a whole congregation. Some of you know, as I do not, the surprises which were taken care of as the work proceeded, and the ingenious solutions which were devised for many and many a problem of reconstruction. I can only imagine those of you working on the restoration task force these last years and now empathize so deeply with that. By late June of 1952, the work was mostly done, and this simple and stately auditorium was dedicated, a tribute to the faith and vision and devotion of two churches that had decided to be one. In fact, the part of the merged church that was called the Beverly Unitarian Fellowship was, in reality, if not in name, an outpost of the People's Liberal Church, for it was established by people living in this neighborhood who were or had been members of People's Liberal Church. A charter member, Miss Elizabeth M. Kendall, tells me that from the start, the hope was that in time the entire membership might be brought together here, but there was opposition in the old church to this new venture. Ties within that church were very strong, and from the establishment of the Beverly Unitarian Fellowship, it was 9 years before the original intent became a fact. At any rate, no matter how you look at it, the beginnings of the Beverly Unitarian Church as it is now go back to the beginnings of People's Liberal Church. And these beginnings occurred more than 80 years ago. As early as 1874, we are told in a historical note in the People's Liberal Church Directory for 1941-1942, quote, "A small group of Universalists and Unitarians met in the little old brick schoolhouse on the present site of the Lewis Champlin School, calling themselves the Christian Union. There was no organization, but preaching on alternate Sundays by volunteer Unitarian and Universalist ministers was regular until the Union ceased in July of 1878. And this quotation continues, in September 1878, the Reverend Miss Florence Colock, then pastor of the Universalist Church in Blue Island, Illinois, preached her first sermon before the Englewood Society in the Masonic Hall on Wentworth Avenue. I should pause just to say, the Universalists, earlier than the Unitarians, ordained and supported women ministers, and here, out west, at least in the late 1800s, was the place where the most women ministers preached and led. Florence Colock, preaching in Blue Island, serving in Blue Island before 1878 and then with us in 1878, would have been one of the very first women ministers in the city of Chicago. And I say that with great pride. A slightly differing interpretation of the beginning, slightly differing account of the beginning, is given in The Messenger, the weekly bulletin of the church for April 14th, 1900. This account stresses the large proportion of Unitarians among the early members of this group and the largeness of their giving toward both of the early buildings. Ms. Colock, in a church register, gives the year of her installation as 1879, so she would have come in the fall of 1878 and been formally installed in the next spring. Late in the year 1880, there was incorporated the First Universalist Society of Englewood. Shall we say that this was the second name of an organization which in the course of perhaps 84 years has borne, officially and unofficially, at least 6 names: the Christian Union, the First Universalist Society of Englewood, the Stewart Avenue Universalist Church, the People's Liberal Church of Chicago, the Beverly Unitarian Fellowship, the Beverly Unitarian Church. A frame church with a tall steeple was built and dedicated for the First Universalist Society of Englewood in 1880, located on 63rd near Princeton. But this church was soon found too small, and in 1889, the church building at 65th and Stewart Avenue was erected. 5 years later, The interior was rearranged, a gallery was added, presumably meaning a balcony, bringing the seating capacity to 700 persons, twice the number previously accommodated. At least 4 persons now living, and known to many of us, became members of this church toward the end of Miss Collock's ministry on March 30th, 1891. Their names are now Mrs. Louis A. Sanford, Mrs. Mary Cuban Lynch, Miss Melissa Roberts, and Miss Flora J. Bates. Miss Collock was an extraordinary person. Born in Waukesha, Wisconsin on January 18th, 1848, she attended the University of Wisconsin and the theological course, which was Universalist, of St. Lawrence University in New York State. St. Lawrence used to be a Universalist college. She was ordained in 1876. Her ministry of this church, covering nearly 13 years, was terminated by her resignation, January 31st, 1892. I have never heard of a minister more deeply respected and loved by his or her congregation. That is an incredibly high compliment coming from Silliman. I remember the very tone of voice in which Miss Bates, who only recently moved to California, speaks of this time, quote, when Miss Collock was our pastor. Mrs. Charles N. Weir remembers from the time she was a little girl, a young lawyer with rather unkempt raven black hair who used to regularly sit in the pew in front of that occupied by her family. Everyone had their assigned pews back then. He was then unknown, but Mrs. Weir's father would say to him, "He has it in him. Someday he will be a great man." The young man was Clarence Darrow. The First Universalist Society of Englewood became a distinguished church under Miss Collock, with prominent men among her hearers, often men whose wives, of a more conservative cast of mind, did not come with them, and with a church school enrolling some of the 300 children. I feel like this is the point where I have to take pains again to say, this is not my writing, this is Silliman writing in 1958. This is me disavowing institutional sexism. In time, though she was but 44 years old, the work required seemed to be too much for her. She longed for change, and on resigning, spent a year abroad. On her return to America, she resumed her ministry in California. In 1896, she married a widely known Unitarian minister, Joseph Henry Crooker. An account is preserved of a sermon preached by Miss Collock in the Englewood Church something over a year after her resignation to Crowded House. Let me quote a little of it. She had introduced her topic by reading the account of the visionary experience which converted the Apostle Paul. A like experience, she said, may come to all, not the visible and direct voice, but something which, like Paul's vision, becomes a turning point in a person's life. Miss Collock said, "We need to get out of this idea of the supernatural. We need to realize that it is all God's natural law. We need to learn to read the Bible with this thought, that it's a record of the natural, that is, of the natural and the spiritual in men. And to do this, we must get away from some of our teaching and preaching, must learn to be ourselves, to be individual, to reason out our own lines of thought and belief." Remember, this was said in 1893, and in, so to speak, our church. The day after Miss Collock's resignation took effect, in the name of the church, one of the most extraordinary communications was given to her that any minister ever received. I suppose there's only time for part of it, though I'd like to read it all. So the church writes to her, "Dear pastor and friend, for nearly 13 years you have labored in this field. Unusual successes have crowned your efforts. You found here a handful of people gathered under the Universalist's name, a name not then a popular one in this community. You've made it respected. You've made it stand for broad and liberal aims, for strength and union in religious, social, and philanthropic work. Your triumph has been of a dual nature, in spite of creedal bias and the common prejudice against woman occupying the pulpit. Our society has steadily progressed and prospered under your ministrations until it has won an enviable position among its sister churches. Not only for this reason, the church goes on, not only for this reason shall we remember your pastorate, but for the rich gifts you have personally brought us, for the friendship, the sympathy, the encouragement, your helpful and warning words, and best of all, the example of a life which is pure and unselfish, and whose seeking is always upward for truth. You have ever upheld a high standard, character before creed, with generous toleration toward the beliefs of others, have been watchwords for you. So thoroughly have you held the confidence and respect of this parish that we spontaneously and unanimously entrusted to you the delicate task of choosing your own successor, an honor which, so far as we know, has never before been conferred upon a retiring pastor. I think this is true in the entirety of the Universalist tradition in the 19th century, because we call our ministers democratically. The able and highly satisfactory manner in which you have fulfilled this trust proves how wisely we judged when we placed it in your hands. And they finish, dear friend, you have been very near to us all. You are so much to each of our families that it seems almost like breaking up our homes to part with you. But we know that our claims upon your time and sympathies have really become attacks upon your powers of endurance, and that you need to rest. You need relief from the exacting demands of your friends, which have always met such quick and cheerful response at your hands. The wide Atlantic will soon separate us, but we will be with you in spirit, and you with us. The committee which drew up this document consisted of 1 woman and 3 men. The successful pastor of the First Universalist Society of Englewood, following Miss Collock, needed to be a very able person indeed. He was Reverend Rufus Austin White, Reverend Rufus, born 1857, graduate of the Universalist Tufts College. I graduated Tufts too. And Divinity School in Massachusetts. Tufts used to be the home of the Crane Divinity School, closed in the early 1960s. But Tufts was one of the few colleges founded explicitly as a Universalist school in the 1900s. Graduate of the Universalist Tufts College and Divinity School in Massachusetts, and called before his graduation to the important Universalist Church in Newtonville, where he served 8 years. His ministry over what is now your church and mine began immediately upon Miss Collock's retirement and continued for more than 44 years until June 30th, 1936, when he was nearly 79 years old. He survived his resignation but a year. Some years following his graduation, his alma mater conferred upon him the degree of Doctor of Divinity. Remarkably enough, there seems to have been no conflict of loyalties upon his coming. In their parting address to Miss Collock, the committee had said in the name of the whole congregation, "We are not to transfer our affections from you to him. They are broad enough to include him also, and all the more because he has your earnest endorsement and Godspeed." Under Dr. White, a distinguished church reached even greater distinction, for the church shared in and supported the public and civic interests of its many-sided pastor. Dr. White was one of the founders of the Chicago Bureau of Charities. For some time, he was president of the Illinois Children's Home Society. For 5 years, he was a member of the Chicago Board of Education, and for part of that time, its vice president. He started a penny bank system to encourage children's savings, which spread not only throughout Chicago, but throughout the country. For 10 years, he was president of the Oak Havens Old People's Home, the building which was erected in 1922 at 113th Place in Western, an institution now greatly enlarged and known as the Washington and Jane Smith Home, one of the very finest institutions of its kind in the whole country. The people of the church gave dinners and bazaars for its benefit, and Dr. White solicited the wealthy for their contributions. People of this church contributed $60,000 toward the project. In 1922, $60,000. In Dr. White's palmiest days, even the enlarged seating capacity of the church was filled. His salary was commensurate with the character of the church and his own renown. That's a little bit of side-eye. That's just a little bit of side-eye in here. And the revenue of the church came almost entirely from rent of sittings. So rather than a pledge drive where you make a pledge commitment and then fulfill it sort of voluntarily, you would rent out the pews, like you would sell the pew, and this would be your pew to sit in each week. What brought Dr. White his greatest fame was probably the travel lectures, which he gave for 14 years. With camera in hand, he visited first and last nearly every country on the globe, and his lectures, illustrated with stereopticon slides, were said to be even finer than those of the famous Burton homes. Each lecture was given for 3 successive Sunday afternoons in Medina Temple on the north side, which had a seating capacity of 4,200 people. And each Sunday evening, the lecture of the afternoon was repeated in the church, filling auditorium and Sunday school room, with many turned away because no seat was left. For a number of years, Dr. White was on the staff of the Chicago Journal, writing articles at home and while abroad. Both his sermons and his lectures were for 2 or 3 years broadcast in the early days of radio. As a Mason, Dr. White received all the degrees conferred both by the York and Scottish Rites, including the 33rd and last degree. The man had certainly ability and energy. I am exhausted reading this. He was famous as an orator. A pamphlet exists in our church archives describing a Sunday morning service on Memorial Day in 1897 in the Stewart Avenue Universalist Church, attended by veterans of the Civil War and their families. Here's part of the introductory comment. It is not too much to say that the service was most profoundly sympathetic and heart-reaching of any in our experience as a Grand Army post. From the minister's heartfelt homely greeting welling up into voice and eyes, "Now, boys, I want you to feel perfectly at home and act as if you own this church," to the end of the service, the one dominating note was a joyous welcome to the old veterans for what they did and for what they are. It was in the air, and we felt the inspiration of it as much as did the pastor. Mr. White played on our heartstrings at will, bringing alternate tears and smiles, and making friends and admirers of every comrade present. It's probably worth pointing out that in 1958, sermons were a lot longer than they are today. What was religion as Dr. White interpreted it in his pulpit? Dr. White was a liberal of liberals, and one of the most momentous actions of his church was taken in consequence of the broad outlook which his people shared with him. The severing of the relations of this church with the Universalist Convention of Illinois, and its continuance as a completely independent religious body known as People's Liberal Church, incidentally, not to be confused with People's Church, a different church on the north side of Chicago. In the end, this action almost killed the church, but surely at the time this church assumed its independent status, no church could have seemed more completely capable of fending for itself. It had everything: wealth, distinction, a renowned minister. Not all points of the story are as yet quite clear to me. There was some criticism of Dr. White or the First Universalist Society of Englewood, or both, in the Universalist Convention of Illinois. This cut Dr. White to the quick, and he felt that in consequence he could no longer continue as a Universalist minister. In 1903, at the annual meeting of the church, and subsequently the question came up of the monetary and other relations of the church with the Universalist denomination and the state convention, and the subject of a suggested change in the name of the society, or the organization of a new independent society without a theological creed, but in place thereof a platform or a declaration of religious and ethical principles. And a committee was appointed to go into the matter. There was much discussion, and the situation was considered at more than one church meeting. I like to think that is like a church joke in there. You know what considered at more than one church meeting means. It was finally settled by compromise in October 1904. The legal name of the church, the First Universalist Society of Englewood, was not changed, but for all practical purposes, this was to be known as the People's Liberal Church. In the year 1919, the congregation was reorganized, and from that time until the merger of 1951, the legal name of the church was the People's Liberal Church of Chicago. From as early as the year 1898, these words, in slightly varying form, were part of a statement of belief and aim used by the church, what we might call mission these days, though I've not yet found that they were ever officially adopted. The wording is almost certainly from Dr. White, though I am not aware that his authorship is anywhere acknowledged. Quote, "Our aim is to make a free and fearless church, seeking truth wherever it may be found, tolerant of the differing opinions of others, anxious for an interpretation of religion that will be in harmony with modern knowledge, and which shall satisfy the spiritual cravings of men without doing injustice to their intellectual common sense." This is 1898. We hold that religion is one of the primal, persistent, native instincts of the human mind, that it rests upon rational, indestructible grounds, that it is fundamental, moral and spiritual principles, and that its fundamental, moral and spiritual principles are invulnerable, and that the best definition of religion is love to God and man, or inspiration and service. We hold that the best unifying force in church life is common service instead of common belief, that men cannot believe alike, but can love alike, that a church is not merely a place to get something for self, but a place to do something for others, an institution to help make a heaven here and now, that a practical religion is not creed, but deed. Our motto is the union of all who love in the service of all who suffer and need help. And he continues, without slavishly binding ourselves to the statements set forth in this belief and aim of the church, or accepting it as a creed in the sense of limiting the thought or vision of the individual, we adopt the principles herein set forth as a rallying point for our instinctive religious convictions and hope. I like that rallying point in the old sense of it, that point where everyone's going to come together to get together before they head off again, or come together from all their scattered lives, the rally point where we all meet up. Several years before the resignation of Dr. White, the neighborhood had begun to change, and the membership, once living almost entirely within walking distance from the church, was already widely dispersed. And I have to pause here because usually in the city of Chicago, a line like "the neighborhood began to change" is white person code for people who weren't white moved into the neighborhood. But I actually think that's not what he's describing here. I think what he's saying is that in the 1930s and even in the late 20s, Englewood was becoming an immigrant neighborhood. Folks who were coming directly from Europe and settling. It was becoming a poorer neighborhood. So this line, several years before the resignation of Dr. White, the neighborhood had begun to change, I want to suggest is not a subtle racist line so much as a subtle classist line. The membership, once living almost entirely within walking distance from the church, was widely dispersed already. Toward the end, Dr. White's health began to give way, yet the church had no connection with any larger religious movement. And as the retirement of Dr. White drew near, the congregation suffered bewilderment. Some thought the church had done its work, and with the retirement of Dr. White had better close its doors, but the majority had the courage to go on. At length, the Divinity School of the University of Chicago was contacted, and a promising young man about to graduate, a member of the denomination known as Disciples of Christ, Roy J. O'Brien, was engaged as Dr. White's successor. I gather that no man has ever had a more difficult position. Even the man's name was held against him, though the church continued active under his leadership. Well aware of the difficulties in which an independent church is set, Mr. O'Brien suggested the church be affiliated with his own denomination, a suggestion carefully considered, then rejected, and the minister himself was soon called to a Disciples of Christ church. The church now realized the necessity of having something in the nature of denominational affiliation. Dr. Preston Bradley, friend of Dr. White, and Dr. Charles Little of the Meadville Theological School, which was up at 57th and Woodlawn, were consulted. And in June 1939, the church voted to take membership in the Chicago Unitarian Council. Young Donald Harrington graduated the year before from Meadville Theological School, and then studying abroad on a fellowship from the school, was recommended as the minister. And on his return to this country, a call was extended to him, which he accepted. And a new era began for the People's Liberal Church. On February 7th, 1940, the church took membership in the Western Unitarian Conference and in the American Unitarian Association. Mr. Harrington was present and participating at the time of the beginnings here in Beverly. In December 1941, the Reverend Lon Ray Call was sent by the American Unitarian Association to serve as an organizing minister on a full-time basis. Organizing minister in the sense of sort of getting the place up and running and going. In 1942, with the rather reluctant consent of People's Liberal Church, and while continuing as its minister, Mr. Harrington became also the first minister of Beverly Unitarian Fellowship. The arrangement was only adopted as a wartime measure. In 1944, Mr. Harrington left Chicago to become the associate to Reverend John Haynes Holmes of Community Church, New York. The two Chicago churches now went their separate ways for a few years. Beverly with the Reverend Jack Mendelson and the Reverend Helgi I.S. Borgford as the minister at People's Liberal Church. The two Chicago churches went their way. Okay, so in Beverly, there's Reverend Jack Mendelson, and then Reverend Helgi Borgford. And at People's Liberal Church, there's Reverend Robert Hoagland, and then Reverend William Hammond as its minister. You will not be tested on this information. Reverend Hartley C. Ray was never settled as minister of People's Liberal Church, though he served it for something like a year in a temporary capacity while studying at University of Chicago. With the merger of the two churches, the settlement of Mr. Ray as minister of the combined church, and the new life, beginning then and continuing now, yet another era was inaugurated in this history of more than 80 years. Such is, in brief, the story. There were the first years with little or no organization. There were the successive pastorates of Miss Collock, Dr. White, and Mr. O'Brien, providing 61 years of ministerial leadership without any interim. Then there was the withdrawal of the church in 1904 from active fellowship in the Universalist denomination. There was the taking up of fellowship in 1939 and 1940 with the Unitarian denomination. Years of uncertainty, in fact, began sometime before the retirement of Dr. White. And while the establishment of the Beverly Unitarian Fellowship in 1941 and 42 was a momentous event in this long history, and though each of the churches carried on a full program of activities in the years that followed, neither church was able to reach full security and stability by itself. The establishment of the Beverly Unitarian Fellowship in the first place was made possible by subsidy from the American Unitarian Association. And the combined church was also subsidized until a year or two ago, mid-1950s. Actually, the total invested here through almost 15 years was $19,700. Beverly Unitarian Church of today owes a debt of gratitude toward the American Unitarian Association for assistance of such magnitude. And widespread among us is a sense of obligation to the larger cause through the United Unitarian Appeal. Momentous have been the changes of these more than 80 years. Church-going was more an accepted social custom in the early years than it is now. He's writing in 1958, this is the height of what I think of as the baby boom. This is the peak of 20th century church-going. He says, church-going was a more accepted social custom in the earlier years than it is now. And there was less than there would be today to compete with the immensely popular Sunday evening programs of the church. Liberalism in religion was then something new and rather daring. A liberal minister of great gifts obtained a fairly ready hearing. Indeed, Chicago was for some time a town of hugely popular liberal religious movements, of which only those survive now which adhere to an organized denomination. In its religious point of view, this church, under the leadership of its first two ministers, Miss Collock and Dr. White, took its place as a pioneer. Clearly, there were deep loyalties of one kind and another in the hearts of the people of the church throughout its years of greatest growth and strength, as the First Universalist Society of Englewood and the People's Liberal Church. Perhaps the changes of the years have made us conscious of the need for a commitment deeper still to church and cause. Only so can a liberal church maintain its vigor and enhance the services of different kinds it renders. More than ever, it is and has to be a fellowship, whatever name it bears. He closes with this. He says, I hesitate to say what I believe to be the truth, that never in the long history of this church have its people given so much to it in terms alike of money and of hours of different kinds of service. What the future may hold for this church, we cannot know and cannot determine, but we can leave for those who shall come after us a great potential. Not everyone who has been associated with this church has sensed the meaning of it all. Perhaps nobody can. We are here today because many men and women, through a period of more than 80 years, had faith. Friends, it's 62 years later. 62 years since Vincent Silliman reviewed and interpreted at some length the history of the church. And his words are as true now as they were then. What the future may hold for this church, ours just as it was his and theirs, what the future may hold for this church, we cannot know and cannot determine. But we can leave for those who come after us a great potential. Not everyone who's been associated with this church has sensed the meaning of it all. Nobody can. But we are here today because we are a people of hope, a people of faith, a people remembering our history, and a people who believe a future is coming and doing our part to make it beautiful and just. Amen.